All right, let's get started. So we left off in this slide yesterday. We were talking about puberty with the female's reproductive system. And, on the surface, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the GnRH coming from the hypothalamus, and then the gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, and, give me a moment, luteinizing hormone being released from the anterior pituitary gland. But after that, that's where the differences start to begin, because follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone go to an ovary instead of a testes. So, as puberty is progressing, there's different stages. There's the stage where the breasts start to develop, where we have pubic and axillary hair pop in. There's memarchy and then pubarchy, and then we have menarche. Menarche is the first mens, or the first menstrual cycle. This is worth emphasizing as we look at this. As humans, we need fat to have a menstrual cycle. We need at least 17% body fat in a young lady for her to have a menstrual cycle. And this is one of the reasons why, when we look at differences between males and females have softer skin because they have a little bit more adipose tissue in the subcutaneous or hypodermic region. As we look at that fat, this is one of the hormones we did not get to with the digestive system. Fat releases a hormone called leptin, and this is kind of a negative feedback hormone. The more fat you have in your body, or the more adipose cells you have in your body, the more leptin will be released. Leptin's primary function is to make it so that you don't feel hungry. It's a hunger suppressant. And the idea behind leptin, when we look at its main purpose, is that if you have a lot of adipose tissue, your appetite will be suppressed so that hopefully you'll go back towards a healthier body weight. There's a secondary effect of leptin, though. Leptin stimulates gonadotropin secretion. And women need those gonadotropins for the menstrual cycle. There's a very rare situation, it's fairly rare, I should say, with bariatric males, or morbidly, or maybe not morbidly, but very overweight males. They have lots of adipose tissue making lots of leptin. That leptin causes there to be excessive gonadotropin release and causes those males to have breast development and every once in a while lactation. But that's pretty rare. If there's not enough body fat, there's not enough leptin. Not enough leptin means not enough gonadotropins, and then we lose the menstrual cycle. When we look at probably about the first year of a woman having a menstrual cycle, it's anovulatory. In other words, there's no egg being ovulated. After about that first year of having menstrual cycles, and usually they're fairly irregular the first year, then you can assume that there's going to be an egg associated with ovulation. When we look at estradiol, that's one of the 3 estrogens we talked about 2 slides ago. Estradiol is the most potent and it's the most common of the 3. And it does all kinds of different things. It stimulates that metaplasia of the vagina, where the simple cuboidal epithelium transforms to a stratified squamous epithelium between the prepubescent and postpubescent young ladies. We have growth of ovaries and secondary sex organs, and estradiol is going to stimulate growth hormone secretion, human growth hormone secretion. And since young ladies hit puberty about 2 years before, or I should say, since young ladies start adolescence, about 2 years before young men, they have that surge of growth hormone 2 years before the young men. And think back to like when you're in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. All of a sudden, all the girls are taller than all the young men because they had the surge of growth hormone a year or 2 before the young men did. Estradiol redistributes fat. This is when the fat starts to preferentially get deposited in the breast or mammary region, and then also helps to reform the pubic girdle or pelvic girdle so that the hips themselves become wider, both in terms of the skeletal structure, we'll have the flaring of the iliac spine in response to this hormone, but in terms of adipose or fat being preferentially deposited on the hips and the mons pubis. Estradiol will thicken skin like testosterone does in the males, but it's not as potent as testosterone for thickening the skin. So when we look at a woman in her 20s compared to a young girl, that woman in her 20s will have thicker skin because of the estradiol. The other hormone is progesterone. Both estradiol and progesterone are going to be released from the ovary. And when we think of progesterone, I want you to think of the hormone that preps the uterus, particularly the endometrium of the uterus. That progesterone is going to be responsible for the development of the uterine glands. It really promotes the development and maturation of the uterine glands. And since about 1/2 of us have had labs so far, think back to what those demo scopes you've looked at in lab this week, when we had the first half of the monthly cycle, the second half, and then you had the menstrual phase. And you can see how those uterine glands change in the within the endometrium over the course of the monthly cycle. Now, this is where things are going to start to get a little bit more complicated. In the male reproductive system, it's really straightforward. We have only negative feedback loops. The female reproductive system, though, is just a little bit more complicated. We go from a negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop, back to a negative feedback loop, all over the course of a monthly cycle. And there's very dramatic changes and fluctuations within hormonal concentrations within the female's bloodstreams. The estrogen and progesterone, as those concentrations go up, they can either suppress or potentially promote follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormone secretion via negative or positive feedback. When we look at inhibin will selectively suppress follicle-stimulating hormone secretion, just like in males. So in males, the testes will release inhibin. Inhibin causes there to be no follicle-stimulating hormone, so the male stops spermatogenesis, but the inhibin doesn't stop luteinizing hormone. So for males, the inhibin doesn't downregulate testosterone production. And in females, inhibin doesn't downregulate luteinizing hormone production. So this hormone itself isn't going to inhibit ovulation. So, as the woman is going through her life cycle, unlike with males, where there's kind of a gradual decline in sex hormones over the course of the male's lifetime, within the woman's lifetime, typically around the age of 45 to 50, 55, depending on individual health, the woman will have a very dramatic change in her hormonal concentrations. That is known as climacteric, and most individuals don't necessarily focus on the climacteric aspect of it, but instead will focus on menopause. And when we think of menopause, the root words here are men for the mensine or menstrual flow. And when we think of pause, think of stopping something. Menopause is when menstrual cycles or menstrual flows have stopped for 12 months. And usually leading up to that 12-month period of time, the menstrual cycle becomes kind of irregular. So instead of being once every 28 days, or depending on the cycle, some women are longer, some are shorter, it becomes infrequent, irregular, and then it just stops altogether. When we look at a woman, she's going to be born with about 2 million eggs. And those eggs are going to be primordial follicles. And as she progresses throughout her life cycle, she's not going to have 2 million menstrual cycles. Thank goodness. That'd be a lot. By the time she reaches, the ages of about 45 to 55, there's about 1,000 follicles left. So as we're looking at these 2 million eggs, there'll be about 2 million follicles associated with those eggs. And as the woman ages, there's an exponential decline in the number of follicles within her ovaries. Other things that are going to happen associated with menopause is that the uterus and vagina and breast atrophy. They actually reduce in size because they aren't going to be exposed to the progesterones and the estrogens and the hormones that were responsible for the metaplasia and for the development of the glandular tissue of the breast and for the redistribution of the fat, the adipose in the breast. When I've worked with geriatric female cadavers, so this was a cadaver of someone who lived to be about in their late 80s, early 90s, the breast area, the breast tissue, is more or less indistinguishable from a male cadaver of the same age because that woman has gone decades without the hormones that have preferentially deposited adipose tissue in her breast. The skin itself becomes thinner, bone mass declines, in particular in response to the lack of estrogen, and we also have blood vessels constricting and dilating in response to these hormone fluctuations. And in particular, right about, starting a couple years before the woman hits menopause, the hormones will oftentimes cause superficial blood vessels to vasodilate, causing lots of blood to rush to the surface of the skin, and for that female to experience an increase in superficial body temperature, or the hot flash. So it's worth mentioning when we think of menopause that this value, this number, has been increasing over the last century. A century ago, menopause was at the ages of 35 to 45. So as human health and human nutrition has been improving, the fertile span of a woman's life has been expanded as well. As we look at the sexual cycle, or the reproductive cycle. We have reproductive and sexual cycles. A lot of times they're used as synonyms with each other, but we're going to distinguish them and separate them out from each other. When we think of the reproductive cycle, I want you to think of lifespan. And when you think of sexual cycle, I want you to think of monthly cycles. So reproductive is going to be over the lifetime. Sexual cycle is going to be over the month. And within that sexual cycle, we have two subdivisions. We have the ovarian and the menstrual cycle, and they are intertwined with each other. They're two sides of the same coin. They work together for that sexual cycle. So let's first talk about the ovarian cycle. Within the ovarian cycle, we have oogenesis, meiosis of the female gamete. We'll have the precursor egg, which is diploid, and that precursor egg is going to be turned into a haploid gamete. So we're going to cut the number of chromosomes in half. This is typically going to happen once a month within a female human's reproductive cycle. Now, I had a really good question Tuesday afternoon during lab. A student asked me, hey, Mr. Durst, if this happens about once a month, or there's about one ovulation a month, how come I see 3 mature follicles on the same ovary on the same microscope slide? How come there's 3 ovulations happening at the same time? And I thought that was an excellent question. Here's why the slides you have in lab are extra productive. We can say when those slides are made, a lot of times they're harvested from turkeys, and the turkeys are dosed with luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone before the ovary is harvested, so that there's lots of follicles to look at. In a human being, though, we typically don't give a human woman FSH and LH injections as part of her monthly cycle. Now, if the woman is going through reproductive therapy, yes, that will happen, and yes, there can be multiple ovulations. I'm thinking of the Octomom right now. In the late 90s, she had octuplets. She had 8 ovulations fertilized at the same time. Oofta. Thankfully, it's one at a time in most situations. One baby at a time is enough. So, when we're looking at this process of oogenesis, we start off with the primordial stem cell, or that oogonia. And it's going to be within a primordial follicle. You do not need to know primordial follicle for lab, but what we're talking about in lecture, it's going to be surrounded by a simple squamous epithelium. And here's some primordial follicles with a primary oocyte in the center. In terms of the number of primordial follicles that make it to the mature stage, or the Graafian stage, over the course of the woman's lifetime, we're looking at about 480 ovulation events, or follicles that maturate. So we're looking at about 480 menstrual cycles over an average woman's reproductive lifespan. And as this ovary is exposed to gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, from the anterior pituitary gland, we are going to have the oocytes start to move through the process of oogenesis, going from a diploid to a haploid cell. In particular, we look at about 24 oocytes a month, making it to the end of meiosis 1. So at the beginning of the monthly cycle, we aren't necessarily sure which oocyte is going to be ovulated. It's kind of a competition to see which one makes it to the finish line, so to speak. And as these oocytes are going through oogenesis, they'll divide, and the first round of division is going to produce daughter cells of unequal size. And those daughter cells of unequal size are very important. The bigger daughter cell is the one that's ultimately going to turn into the ovum, or the egg. Unlike with males, when males go through spermatogenesis, we start with one parent cell and we get 4 equally sized sperm cells at the end. When a female goes through oogenesis, we start with one parent cell and we get a ginormous egg and then 3 little tiny pieces of leftover at the end. And the reason for this has to do with fertilization and the development of the child during the embryonic stage. This egg needs to contain enough cytoplasmic nutrients and enough organelles to go through multiple rounds of cell division without receiving any new nutrition. So the female's reproductive system puts all of the nutrients into the one egg as opposed to separating them equally among 4 haploid gametes. The leftovers that we get rid of, or that the woman gets rid of, is called a polar body. And a polar body is just a little chunk of genetic material, a set of chromosomes. It contains a little bit of phospholipids, and it does not contain any organelles. It's just genetic material being ejected from the forming egg. And once a month, one of those 24 oocytes that made it to the end of meiosis 1, one of them is going to be just a little tiny bit bigger than the rest. You really won't be able to see it on a microscope slide, but one is just a little bit more developed. And it's that one that's just slightly farther advanced that gets selected hormonally to complete oogenesis. Well, to make it, I should say, make it farther through oogenesis. So after one of those oocytes starts to develop, it will make it to the secondary stage. And it will pause at metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. And it's worth emphasizing that meiosis has not finished at the time of ovulation. When a woman ovulates, she doesn't ovulate a haploid cell. She actually ovulates a cell that is almost done with meiosis. So let's say we have ovulation occur, and this should be a 2N right here, not a 1N. That's a typo from your textbook. If ovulation occurs, we will ovulate, we being human beings ovulate a secondary oocyte, and if that secondary oocyte is not exposed to a sperm cell, it just shrivels up and is absorbed into the female's reproductive tract. If that secondary or ovulated oocyte is exposed to a sperm cell, that secondary oocyte has a chunk of genetic material on the edge of the cell, and that chunk of genetic material near the cell membrane is ejected, and we get rid of that second polar body. So for oogenesis to finish, the secondary oocyte needs to be penetrated by a sperm cell. After that sperm cell's nucleus has combined with the oocyte's nucleus, we now have a unique human genome. And that unique human genome goes back to being diploid. And instead of having an egg fused with a sperm, the technical term is a zygote. It is one human cell with a unique human genome, and it's a very large human cell that immediately starts to go through rapid rounds of reproduction, or I should say division, and ultimately it turns into a full-grown human being. Each and every one of us started off as that one-celled zygote. Now, when we look at the sexual cycle, or we could think of it as the monthly cycle, an average sexual cycle is about 28 days long for a reproductively viable female. Now, we say average, but only about 10% of women have an average monthly cycle of about 28 days. 90% of women have a longer or a shorter monthly cycle, and it can be as short as 20 days or as long as 45 days. I remember my high school biology teacher made a big point of emphasizing that this 28-day cycle typically will follow a lunar cycle as well. Whether or not that's a coincidence or if there's some developmental aspect of that, I don't know, but it's worth mentioning lunar cycles are also 28 days, 28.5 days. When we look at the hormones of the female's reproductive tract, they come from the hypothalamus, go to the pituitary gland, and then those pituitary hormones, so follicle stimulating and the luteinizing hormones, travel to the ovary and start to regulate the ovary. The ovary is then going to secrete hormones that travel to the uterus and regulate the uterus. So in terms of the steps or the stages, we start with the hypothalamus, we go to the anterior pituitary, then to the ovaries, and then finally the signal gets sent to the uterus. They're all interconnected to each other. And then the ovary and the uterus, or in particular the ovary, is going to then go back and control the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So as we're looking at this process, the figure I have on the bottom of the screen shows the gonadotropin concentrations over the course of the month and how those correlate to follicle development within the ovary. So early on in the woman's monthly cycle, we'll say day, right here at this dashed line, that's day 14, which is ovulation on day 14. So we'll say at about, let's say day 2 or 3, there's a surge in follicle stimulating hormone. And that surge in follicle stimulating hormone helps the primary follicle become a secondary and then become a mature or Graafian follicle. For the record, this edition of this textbook is the first time I've ever seen the term tertiary follicle. So when we think of tertiary follicles here in lecture, I want you to think mature follicle or a Graafian follicle. It'll be one per monthly cycle, unless we have paternal twins or paternal triplets, or hopefully not octuplets. And as we have the surge in follicle stimulating hormone goes down, and eventually, right before ovulation, there's a dramatic surge, a huge spike in luteinizing hormone concentrations. And this is the hormone that ultimately triggers ovulation. So after we have the spike in luteinizing hormone, there's a little bit of a delay, but we'll have the ovulation of the secondary oocyte. And I particularly like this figure because it helps to emphasize that mature follicle, the Graafian follicle, doesn't just disappear after ovulation. Instead, those granular cells of the follicle go through metaplasia. They morph and change and become a new structure known as the corpus luteum. And then over the course of that monthly cycle, the corpus luteum continues to morph and change and becomes the corpus albicans. And eventually, it shrivels up and becomes a tiny little piece of scar tissue on the surface of the ovary. So as we're looking at this cycle, we have, for the first half of the cycle, follicular phase. Follicular phase is a term that's usually going to be applied to the ovary because the follicle is developing on the ovary during follicular phase. And then after follicular phase, we have ovulation. So that day 14, that ovulatory event, is a milestone in the monthly cycle to help to separate the first half, follicular phase, from the second half, which is the luteal phase. Now, in terms of when we start counting, when do we start keeping track of the days and start counting days? It's the beginning of menstrual flow. Day 1 of the monthly cycle, for bookkeeping purposes, is the first day of a woman's period. So follicular phase typically lasts about 2 weeks after the beginning of a woman's period. Another way to think of this is after a woman's period, about 2 weeks after the period starts, there's going to be ovulation. So ovulation happens at about day 14 on a quote-unquote average monthly cycle. After day 14, that follicle becomes the luteum, the corpus luteum. And when we think of the corpus luteum, I want you to focus on the ovary itself. So the oocyte has left the ovary, and during luteal phase, the follicle has been morphed to the corpus luteum and eventually the corpus albicans. And that corpus luteum is going to release more hormones to help regulate the uterus. In particular, the corpus luteum is going to secrete a lot of progesterone to help the uterus go from the proliferative phase to the secretory phase, as that progesterone stimulates the development of uterine glands. So, as we look at that ovarian cycle, is that a duplicate slide? No, it's not. We have the follicular phase, followed by ovulation, followed by the luteal phase. These figures on the next couple slides, I brought in from outside of your textbook because I really wanted something to help emphasize this process for you. During follicular phase, that first half of the monthly cycle, we have a lower concentration of the female sex hormones. There's a slightly lower concentration of estrogen, and there's effectively no progesterone being released. Low concentrations of estradiols have an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus. They downregulate the concentrations of GnRH being produced by the hypothalamus. Now, there's still going to be just a little tiny bit of GnRH being secreted, and that little tiny bit of GnRH is going to go to the anterior pituitary gland and cause just a little tiny bit of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to be secreted. So at the first half of the monthly cycle, generally speaking, the anterior pituitary gland is going to be releasing low concentrations of LH and FSH. Those low concentration of gonadotropins travel to the ovary and cause a follicle to develop slowly. There's very slow development of the follicle during this first half, or first portion. Then, starting at about day 10 of the monthly cycle, the follicle has been growing larger and larger and larger, and slowly been growing larger. Eventually, the follicle becomes so large that it's releasing so much estrogen, so much estradiol, that we go from a low inhibitory concentration to a high excitatory concentration. So let me flip back a slide here. Low concentrations at the beginning of the monthly cycle inhibit GnRH secretion. But as that follicle is slowly growing, the follicle produces more and more estrogen, and at about day 10-ish of the monthly cycle, the follicle is producing enough estrogen that we go from an inhibitory to an excitatory concentration. A positive feedback loop sets in. And now the estrogen coming from the follicle promotes the release of GnRH. And once we have GnRH being promoted, we have more and more GnRH. That causes there to be more and more luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. As the concentration of follicle-stimulating hormone goes up, the follicles get bigger. A bigger follicle makes more estrogen, which then causes there to be more GnRH, which causes there to be more follicle-stimulating hormone. It's a positive feedback loop. It amplifies the hormonal concentrations in a very short period of time. I need to back up several slides here. So, early on in the monthly cycle, there are relatively steady concentrations of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. But starting, about day 10-ish, we have an exponential increase. We have a huge surge in those hormones. And that corresponds to shifting from an inhibitory to an excitatory concentration of estradiol. Eventually, as luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone surge, ovulation will occur. that mature follicle, the Graafian follicle, or not, apparently we're calling them tertiary follicles now, will rupture and release the secondary oocyte. So a secondary oocyte has been released. That secondary oocyte is released into the abdominal pelvic cavity of the woman, or the woman. So it's not necessarily going to go directly into her reproductive tract. Some secondary oocytes just kind of wander around and don't make it into the female's reproductive tract. Most of them, though, will make it into the female's reproductive tract. To help that secondary oocyte be directed into the female's reproductive tract, the fimbriae of the uterine tube are pulsating and have this tendency to snag the oocyte. So those little fingers will snag the oocyte and direct it into the infundibulum of the uterine tube. And once that oocyte gets into the infundibulum of the uterine tube, it's going to be pushed through the uterine tube because of the cilia lining the uterine tube and secretory cells, which are also present in the uterine tube. The cilia move liquids through the uterine tube towards the uterus itself, and the secretory cells secrete the liquid that the oocyte flows within. And we're about at the little past the halfway point right now. So let's pause for a moment and have a review question. Please click on the part of the body that produces the gonadotropins. And the two gonadotropins we've talked about are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So where is the part of the body that makes those two gonadotropins? It's the same for both males and females. Apparently the timer didn't start. Let's say we have about 20 seconds left. All right, 10 more seconds. Please get your answers submitted. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So let's see how we did as a class. That's pretty typical in terms of the answers. So when we think, and this is exactly what I was expecting to get from you as a class response. So when we think of gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, those gonadotropins are released from the anterior pituitary gland, which is right up in your skull. It sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So the students that clicked the face, or right around, like right in between the eyeballs, that's the best spot to have clicked on this picture. Follicle stimulate, the gonadotropins are not secreted by the breasts or the uterus or ovaries. So, how can a woman know if she's ovulating? I mean, there's the timing thing. You can go, okay, it's been 14 days since I had the beginning of my period. I'm probably ovulating at this time. But that's assuming there's a standard 28-day monthly cycle. And since 90%-ish of American women don't have a 28-day cycle, just counting days isn't necessarily the most reliable. And from month to month, and particularly from year to year, the time of the monthly cycle or duration can change. So let's talk about physical changes in the woman's body. The woman's body is going to have a slight increase in body temperature, about 1/2 of a degree Fahrenheit increase in baseline body temperature. The woman will also have a change in the cervical mucus. The mucus plug that keeps microorganisms out of the cervix, out of the woman's reproductive tract, becomes thinner, more receptive to sperm at the time of ovulation. So during the first half of the monthly cycle, when there is no point in letting anything in to the uterus, the cervical mucus is kind of thick. Sometimes it's been described as chunky. I read one lecture textbook that described it as like curdled milk, which is not the best imagery. It's this really thick mucus that does a great job of keeping microorganisms and sperm from getting into the female's reproductive tract. But at the time of ovulation, when there's a secondary oocyte that is ready to be fertilized, the cervical mucus becomes very thin and watery. Nearly every resource I looked at described it as egg white consistency. I know some young ladies that have done natural family planning, and they keep a log book on the toilet in their bathroom. And I remember once I was being nosy, and I opened up the log book, and I was like, oh, cool. And the woman, every single day, at the same time, every single day, recorded her weight, recorded her waist diameter right around the pubic region, and then recorded body temperature to 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit, and then also kept track of the consistency of the mucus plug. And for women that keep detailed records like that, they can know exactly when they're ovulating, and they can use natural family planning very successfully as a method of birth control. Most women don't do that, though. So natural family planning usually results in a lot of surprises. Now, in terms of the actual physical ovulation event, there's another thing that not every woman, but a lot of women will report, and that's a this is a German word, and I'm going to butcher it, the Mittelschmerz pains. And it's, all right, here's a bad analogy, but you know when you pop a pimple on your face, it kind of hurts a little bit when you're in middle school. The follicle, that mature follicle, has a fluid-filled cyst that in many ways is analogous to a pimple that's filled with fluid. And when it ruptures, when it bursts, a lot of women report a twinge of pain in their lower abdomen on either the left or the right side, depending on which ovary is ovulating that month. This is just good information to know because you're going to be doing family planning someday. A secondary oocyte is viable for about 24 hours after ovulation. I'm going to say that again because this is a very key piece of information for family planning purposes. That secondary oocyte can be fertilized for about 24 hours after ovulation. So in other words, 2 days after ovulation, the woman can have intercourse and not worry about conception. I forgot to mention this with the male reproductive system. Sperm remain viable in the female's reproductive tract for 6 to 7 days. So if a woman has intercourse without a barrier method in place 2 or 3 days before ovulation, there are viable sperm in her reproductive tract at the time that there could potentially be a viable egg in her reproductive tract. So sperm can last for 6 to 7 days in the female's reproductive tract. The secondary oocyte is viable for 24 hours in the female's reproductive tract. 2 numbers you should commit to memory. So we've gone through the build-up, we've gone through follicular phase, we've gone through ovulation, we've had a negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop. Now, just for kicks, let's go back to a negative feedback loop. So now that ovary no longer has a follicle. Instead, the ovary has ovulated and the leftover tissue from the follicle has morphed and become the corpus luteum, or the yellow scar or yellow cyst. And the corpus luteum is now going to be releasing progesterone and estradiol. So the change here is progesterone. We added a new hormone. The progesterone is not going to be released until after ovulation. Pre-ovulation, the ovary is only going to be releasing, or primarily going to be releasing, estradiol. Post-ovulation, progesterone has been added into the mix. And we have a low concentration of estradiol and a low concentration of progesterone. And in particular, progesterone is a potent inhibitor of GnRH and of the gonadotropins. The low concentration of estradiol acts as an inhibitor of GnRH production. But that progesterone, all by itself, is always going to act as an inhibitor. Progesterone will never act as a promoter or an amplifier of the gonadotropins. So when we look at progesterone, it's going to downregulate the amount of GnRH, and it downregulates the amount of gonadotropins that are being produced. So let's think about this pragmatically speaking. We're at the second half of the woman's monthly cycle. She's ovulated, and at this point in time, she really doesn't want to ovulate again. There's no functional purpose to ovulating during the second half of the monthly cycle. And this progesterone, in particular, is a potent inhibitor of the hormones that trigger ovulation and follicular development. This is also the hormonal basis of birth control pills, or the pill for birth control. When that pill was first made, there was relatively, let me go back to green, or let's go to blue here. There was relatively high concentrations of progesterone, and over the decades since the birth control pill first hit the market, we found that very low concentrations of progesterone still have a potent inhibitory effect on the GnRH and the gonadotropins. There's even a progesterone-only version of the pill that some women will take while they're breastfeeding because the progesterone will still inhibit ovulation, but they aren't going to alter their estrogen concentrations and interfere with their ability to lactate and breastfeed. So I can't emphasize this enough. Progesterone is a potent inhibitor of GnRH and the gonadotropins, and progesterone is released by the corpus luteum during the second half of the woman's monthly cycle. So, the corpus luteum is releasing these hormones, and they do more than just act on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones also are going to travel to the uterus. They are getting into the bloodstream, and they go to all parts of the body, including the endometrium of the uterus. And as these hormones travel to the endometrium, they cause changes within the endometrium. In particular, progesterone is going to promote the development of the endometrium and the maturation of uterine glands. And let's think about this functionally. The woman has just ovulated. That egg, or that, we'll be technical, that secondary oocyte could potentially be fertilized and become a zygote. And if it lands or implants in the endometrium, it's going to need to start receiving nutrition immediately. And that's why there's the development of the uterine glands within the endometrium, so that if there is a fertilized egg, a zygote that implants, it can start to receive nutrition from the uterine glands right away. So as we look at that corpus luteum, the hormone that changes it, that alters it, is luteinizing hormone. Not only does luteinizing hormone trigger ovulation, it triggers the development of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is then going to release estradiol and progesterone. We have a dramatic increase of those hormones. Progesterone is going to prep our uterus during the secretory phase. It's what takes the uterus from the proliferative phase to the secretory phase. Now, as we look at these two hormones, the estradiol and the estradiol and the progesterone, those are going to downregulate, and I think I've said this 4 or 5 times so far today, those downregulate. In particular, the progesterone helps to downregulate the release of GnRH and the gonadotropins. But just like males producing inhibin from their gonads, the female will also produce some inhibin. And that inhibin is going to work along with the progesterone and the low concentrations of estrogen to downregulate the release of GnRH and FSH and LH. Now, after ovulation, we had the corpus luteum form, and that corpus luteum doesn't remain there forever. Eventually, the corpus luteum starts to get smaller. And as the corpus luteum starts to get smaller, after a couple days, it starts to shrink. The corpus luteum will release less progesterone and less estrogen. and as the concentration of progesterone declines, I know this, the endometrium also is going to downregulate, and those uterine glands within the endometrium are going to start to degenerate, and eventually, if the corpus luteum continues to decline, eventually it becomes a corpus albicans, or a small white scar, as opposed to a large yellow scar on the surface of the ovary. And as we have the corpus albicans form, the progesterone concentrations go down, and eventually the endometrium will enter the premenstrual phase. You'll see necrotic fragments lining the endometrium, and we'll have the beginning of the sloughing off that forms the menstrual flow. So when we think of ovulation, usually it's one ovary per cycle. Every once in a while, you'll see two follicles that are indistinguishable from each other. They're basically at the same developmental stage after meiosis 1. And then we'll have two follicles develop at the same time as opposed to the one follicle that typically will happen. And that's how we will get the paternal twins. Let's move on and focus on the menstrual cycle. So now we're going to focus on the lining of the uterus and how the ovary and the hormones from the ovary affect the uterus within the female's reproductive tract. This menstrual cycle is going to involve the buildup of the functional layer of the endometrium, prepping it for implantation of a zygote and development of a child, or if there is no implanted zygote and developing child, the sloughing off and recycling and degrading and restarting of the entire process. So when we think of the menstrual cycle, or the uterine cycle as it's sometimes referred to as, day 1 is going to be mensing, or the beginning of the period. And that typically will last for a couple days. And after that period of time, the woman will have the proliferative phase. The proliferative phase is officially separated, so that proliferative phase is separated from the secretory phase by that ovulatory event. That line that's going through this figure corresponds to day 14 of the average cycle. As we look at the menstrual phase, on average, it lasts about 5 days with heavy flow on days 1 and 2, and then the flow of the menstrual blood is diminished until we hit the 5th day, when it pretty much stops and the woman's uterus is starting to enter the proliferative phase, where it builds up the endometrium. After that proliferative phase, we're going to have the secretory phase. And if we look at the secretory phase of the endometrium, the uterine glands start to develop a zigzaggy appearance. This secretory phase is during the second half of the monthly cycle, day 15 to day 26. The very last 2 days will be the premenstrual phase. As we look at those uterine glands, sometimes, and in this textbook they refer to it as this, so I went with the textbook term, they're referred to as endometrial glands. And these secrete a fluid that has a high concentration of glycogen. Glycogen is the the animal complex carbohydrate. So this is going to be a very sugar-rich fluid that's being secreted by these endometrial or uterine glands. I've also, in some textbooks and some literature that I've been going over, sometimes I've heard this referred to as uterine milk. And if you ever see the phrase uterine milk, it's referring to this liquid that has a high concentration of glycogen that's secreted by the endometrium of the uterus to help aid the development of the implanted egg. Now, as these glands are developing, eventually the endometrium will need to get thicker to accommodate those glands. The endometrium of the uterus expands to be about half a centimeter thick. And if we think about how there's two sides of the uterus, and if each side becomes half a centimeter thicker, over the course of the monthly cycle, the uterus itself bulges outward about 1 centimeter. And this bulging of the uterus helps to correspond or contribute to the bloating feeling that a lot of women feel at some points during their monthly cycle. The last 2 days of the menstrual cycle or uterine cycle is going to be known as the premenstrual phase. And that's when the endometrium is exposed to a dramatic decline in progesterone. The corpus luteum has fully transformed into a corpus albicans on the ovary, and now that corpus albicans is releasing hardly any progesterone, effectively no progesterone, and hardly any estradiol, and the loss of progesterone combined with the dramatic reduction of estrogen causes the endometrium to start to degrade, and that's when you can see the necrotic fragments start to form on the inside of the uterus as that endometrium begins to slough off. Now, as we're looking at the menstrual phase, or the mensine, this is going to be the beginning of the monthly cycle, day one of the monthly cycle. And, I just have a side story I want to share quickly. When I think of names for people, names that correspond to bodily fluids, generally speaking, aren't they make me snicker. So like if your name was urine, it would make me laugh. And I know somebody whose name was Mency. And I remember very specifically, the first home I bought from them, the couple was Mr. and Mrs. Mency. And I found out their last name while I was signing the mortgage paperwork at the bank. And my wife and I had to do one of those and try not to laugh out loud at them, because deep down inside, I am very immature. So when we think of a mensine, it's a flow of menstrual fluid. It begins day one of the menstrual cycle. How much liquid flows out? This is kind of an interesting question. Most women don't measure the volume of blood that comes out of their vagina during this stage of their monthly cycle. We're looking at about 40 to 35 milliliters of menstrual blood during this 5-day period. That corresponds to those of you who think in American, not metric, about a quarter cup of fluid over a 5-day period of time. Or maybe you think in terms of Christmas cookies, the volume of about 2 Christmas cookies. Yeah, I made Christmas cookies yesterday. So, what about blood clotting? We talked about the blood clotting cascade at the very beginning of this semester. And we talked about the intrinsic cascade and the extrinsic cascade. How come the woman doesn't have a giant blood clot in her uterus? How come it's flowing outwards and we don't have the intrinsic cascade initiating clotting and a big plug of blood? Well, it just so happens that during this degradation, the endometrium releases fibrinolysin. Fibrinolysin is a protein, an enzyme we talked about during the very first unit of the semester. And it's an enzyme that breaks down the fibrin mesh of a blood clot. So because there's fibrinolysin in high concentrations present in menstrual blood, the menstrual blood is incapable of forming a blood clot and will flow very smoothly out of the female's reproductive tract. Let's talk about the female sexual response. When a woman is having intercourse and she's experiencing excitement in Plateau, the labia majora and labia minora become engorged with blood. Just like the male's reproductive tract has erectile tissue, the female also will have erectile tissue as well. It's just not as well developed as the male's erectile tissue. So as the labia minora become engorged with blood and the female is becoming aroused, the labia minora will typically increase in size and protrude beyond the labia majora, and they actually become longer than the labia majora when the female is becoming aroused. This corresponds to the quote-unquote female erection. Something else that happens during this process is blood supply to the female's reproductive tract is increasing. We have the engorgement of the erectile tissue, and as we have increased blood supply to the female's reproductive tract, there'll also be more blood going to that the stratified squamous epithelium of the vagina. That's going to cause an increase in vaginal transducate. In other words, there's going to be a buildup of liquid in the vagina as blood pressure to the vaginal tissues increases, and we have more liquid seeping out into the vagina. We also have some glands of the female's reproductive tract. The greater vestibular glands are going to increase their secretions. Those secretions are going to increase the amount of mucus present in the female's reproductive tract, particularly in between the labia minora. So during this first stage of the female's sexual response, the vagina becomes lubricated with vaginal transducate. The labia minora increase in size, helping to funnel the penis, glans penis towards the vaginal opening, and the labia minora also become lubricated with excessive amounts of mucus from the greater vestibular gland. As this process is going on and developing and progressing, or the process is progressing, let's highlight the uterus. The uterus changes position. By default, the uterus is going to be tilted forward, but as the woman is becoming sexually aroused, the uterus tilts backwards. And this shift in the position of the uterus corresponds to a shift in the cervical canal and some changes to the diameter of the vaginal canal as well. In particular, the lower third of the vaginal canal begins to constrict. This causes the vaginal rugae to hug the penis with tighter frictional forces, increasing the amount of female stimulation and male stimulation during intercourse. The upper end of the vagina begins to expand, forming a pocket that can receive the semen and hold the coagulated semen near the cervix. And the cervical canal becomes a straighter tube or canal, which is going to make it easier for sperm to gain access to the uterus itself. When we look at the other erectile tissues present in the female's body, this is when the clitoris begins to become particularly engorged with blood and will extend beyond the pubis of the female's reproductive tract and allows for increased stimulation of the clitoris as there's penile penetration or frictional forces rubbing on the the mons pubis. And then we also find that the nipples and other erectile tissues are going to be stimulated as well. During the thrusting phase of the male's penile penetration, the female can have the penis entering, and the female can actually have an orgasmic event as well. I remember this is a topic of conversation in the late 90s, early 2000s. Why do females have orgasms if females can become pregnant without an orgasm? Nobody asks why males have to have orgasms. From a biological perspective, if there's no male orgasm, there's no semen, and then there's no delivery of a gamete. So biologically, males really need to have an orgasm for our species to continue. Females, though, do have an advantage from a reproductive perspective to orgasming or having an orgasmic event. As a female is having an orgasm, the cervix will be pulled into the uterus slightly, and there's a slight expansion of the external os, so that the opening of the cervix widens just a little bit as there's those uterine contractions. The pelvic platform itself, or those uterine contractions, are going to be about 0.8 of a second apart, so they're going to be pretty intense contractions of the uterus. I remember her name was Laura. I was talking to Laura about the birth of her second child. And when a woman's giving birth, the uterus starts to contract, and she had very mild uterine contractions that were similar to the contractions she experienced during orgasm. So she told me that early labor was actually a very enjoyable experience for her. Now, as this uterus is going through this peristaltic contraction, and there's this mild dilation of the external os, we have more semen getting in. Remember, semen itself contains prostaglandins, and those prostaglandins cause mild contractions of the uterus itself. In particular, they cause the external os to dilate slightly to allow sperm entry into the female's reproductive tract. Every once in a while, if you look on the left and right sides of the female's external urethral orifice, there's a gland known as the paraurethral gland. Paraurethral meaning on the left and right of the urethra. The old school name for this gland is the Skene's gland. Some women, as they're becoming excited and are entering orgasm, will have their Skene's gland go through vasoconstriction, go through constriction, and they will release a fluid into the female's reproductive tract. This is the female ejaculatory event. It doesn't happen all the time with all women. The woman needs to be very sexually excited. And from woman to woman, not all women have very developed Skene's glands or periurethral glands, but some women do, and they will have the quote-unquote female ejaculation. As a woman's experienced orgasm, much like the male, she's going to have blood rushing to the surface of her body, and we are past time, so we'll talk about orgasms on Tuesday. We are done with class.